I'm here to introduce Dave. Dave's a retired professor of forestry and environmental studies from the University of Maine at Fort Kent. He lives in Fort Kent with his wife of 32 years. She's around here somewhere. Hi, Dave. And pursues his interest in hiking, history, backyard astronomy, native bees, and working his woodlot, and the lot of traveling, which they've been doing lately. And here he is, Dave Hobbins.
Hey, thank you very much. Thank you, fans. Hey, thanks for coming out for this. I have been anxious to do this for a while, so I really appreciate it. As many of you know, my background is insects and diseases of trees. But in 2016, they had a project in the state of Maine. It was a citizen science project. And these volunteers went out to collect bumblebees from 2016 to 2020. They extended it 1 year. Because we wanted to see, or they wanted to see, compared to old data from the 70s and 80s, you know, what was the status of the bumblebees, because all the insects have been disappearing. So anyway, that just lit a fire under me, and I've been doing photography, trying to do photography and observation and literature review of bumblebees, because I find them to be absolutely one of the most fascinating creatures I've ever studied. So the reason is, if you think about the bumblebee, they are responsible for the pollination of a lot of native plants. And not only that, but they set seed and fruit so successfully at a rate 2 to 10 times better than any other animal. They're really fascinating. And I like to think of them as economic and ecological powerhouses. And I'll explain the economic stuff as we go along here. So anyway, again, thanks for being here. Thanks to Senior College for letting me do this. I really appreciate it. So let me introduce you to the bumblebees in my backyard and what you might see in the St. John Valley and what we can do to help them along. So roughly this is what I'm going to do, and I apologize, this camera's just slightly out of focus. So my two really bad pictures, it's the camera, it's not mine.
At our age, Dave, our eyes are slightly.
Okay, thanks, Coach. So I want to talk a little bit about just insects in general, okay, and then about bumblebees themselves, what you're going to find in the valley, and then what's the life cycle of the colony. Because it's nothing like honeybees. They're really small compared to honeybees. I mean, a fraction. And then how do we favor the bees? And I have a couple of things I did in my yard that you can learn from my mistakes. And I apologize to my wife in advance for the ugly yard pictures you're going to see. So when we're looking at insects, one of the things, just started, Matt. All right. When we're looking at insects, remember, scientists look at insects as having 3 body regions. So you have a head, and this applies to the dragonfly as well. You have the thorax, and then you have the abdomen, okay? All insects. They also only have 3 pair of legs, if they have legs. This is adults now. The larvae don't necessarily have to have legs. That separates them from spiders and mites and other arthropods that have, you know, everything that has an exoskeleton. Spiders and mites have 2 body regions, and they have 4 pair of legs, so they don't fall under insects. Although general public would think they're an insect, right? And I'm also going to challenge you with the bee word as well, the bees versus wasp, different people. And then lastly, a lot of the adults have wings. That's why they've been so successful. They can move around really well. In fact, some of you already know there are butterflies that migrate cross-oceanic. I mean, they're just amazing things that insects can do. So, and then briefly, we'll look at the majority of insects fall under 2 categories of development. And the first is what old-timers would call simple metamorphosis. And you think of the grasshopper, right? You don't hear grasshoppers until August. That's because they can't fly until then, right? So they have 3 life stages. They have an egg, an immature, a nymph, where they're going to be feeding and growing and getting bigger and bigger. And then you have the adult. The nymphs are small versions of the adult, but they either don't have wings or they have inverted wings, and they're certainly not sexually mature yet, right? They can't reproduce. And then that's why you hear the crickets and you hear the grasshoppers in the fall, in August rather, because they're mature now, right? So they're flying and they're mating. Otherwise they're hopping prior to that and crawling. So grasshoppers, dragonflies, damselflies, cockroaches, leaf hoppers, if I didn't say that, and the aphids that we all know on our plants, they all fall under this simple metamorphosis. Which leads us to the insects we're interested in, the bees and many other insects. The majority, bees and beetles are the majority of insects in terms of species. Like aphid numbers are incredible, right? But in terms of species, bees and beetles are incredibly prolific. But flies and moths all fall under complete metamorphosis, and they have 4 life stages. So they have an egg. That's my little rendition of an egg. Then you have the larval stage, which is basically a mouth and a bag of food. Okay? If you've ever seen a maggot, this is just like that, except it's not as tapered, right? So there's a mouth here. They might have some like rudimentary, simple eyes, sometimes some of them. But basically the larvae tend to be, especially in the bees and the wasp, because this is a wasp, just a bag that eats and eats and eats. That's all they do. That's their job. So they'll eat, they'll get bigger, so they'll shed their skin to get bigger, you know, and they'll do that majority of the times. It's 4 times, 4 stages. Then they go into a resting stage, which they call the pupa, and they're just waiting there till the genes are kicking in. It's a whole new set of genes developing into an adult. Right? And most of the time, except for the insects that like overwinter as a larva, this is like a 2-week period, or it could be longer, but this is almost always 10 days to 2 weeks, unless it's overwinter or something like that, and then you have the adult. Okay? So this is kind of what the bumblebee larvae look like, even though I've only seen pictures of them because I don't want to dig up a colony, you know, and spoil the queen's fun. So anyway, majority of animals in insecta fall into there. So when we're looking at bees and wasps, wasps evolved about 200 million years ago, and bees evolved from them about 110 million years ago. That's why bees have a stinger, because they got it from the wasp that they evolved from. And we'll talk about differences in a little bit. But all the bees and wasps will have 2 long antennae, right? You don't see that on flies. You have really short antennae. And they always have, if they don't have a stinger, they have an ovipositor, which is how they lay eggs. And then, as I mentioned earlier, ecologically significant and economically important, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a bit. So I thought I'd show you a bee and a wasp. So here's one of my fuzzy pictures, apologies. If you look in general, bees, which evolved from wasps, have a stouter body. They're hairy. Almost every part is hairy, including their abdomen and their legs. This is how they separate out from the wasp, which are more slender. And if you look, a lot of times the abdomen and the legs don't have any hairs at all. Okay? And the scientists will tell you there's always exceptions. Well, there's so many species, there's always going to be exceptions. There's going to be slender bees and there's going to be hairy wasps, but you know, what are you going to do? But anyway, in the bees, this section here towards the end, this is one of the last leg segments. And this and this will not be the same size, whereas in wasp, they're almost all the same size. So that's minor, right? But anyway, in case you're wondering. And that's quite an ovipositor. Oh, the most important thing. All the bees are vegetarians. They eat nectar and pollen. Wasp, which includes, you know, hornets and all that, they feed their young other animals. Flies, you know, anything that Sometimes they chew it and regurgitate it to them. Other times they sting them and they feed them to their young live, and the young feed off of them. And I just took a wasp course in February from Penn State. There is a wasp, I was telling Matt this, I think. There's a wasp that's 4 millimeters in size. It's parasitic, and it has a reduced second pair of wings, has one pair of wings that looks like feather-like. This is 4 millimeters in size. When it flies, it's like us swimming through water. The air is viscous to them. Isn't that amazing? There's so many wasps out there. It's really incredible. Anyway, really fun stuff. So, and no offense to at least 2 of you I know that are honeybee folks. I'm not trying to insult anybody here. So, the honeybee is not native, right? It's introduced, and we get a lot of good out of it. It also has a pouch for pollen, but the only native bee that has that, they call it a curbicula or the pollen basket, is the bumblebee. All of our other none of our other native bees have that. A lot of the native bees have branching hairs, and a lot of them, like, it's not the mason bee, the other bees, they can stuff that in the hairs in their abdomen, but the bumblebee has this, it's a recessed area surrounded by these branched hairs, and they pack that and pack that. Now the reason I wanted to show you this, even though it's slightly out of focus, clover, and it's golden. And when I was studying out at Michigan State, I was with the bee people, and they used to tell me, we know more of what's going on in the plant world than the botanists do, because the bees tell them what's fruiting. So in a little bit, we're going to see blueberry, and blueberry is bright yellow. Clover is golden. It's really cool. So you beekeepers know more than we do about what's going on a lot of times, right? Okay. And the other thing is that these are much bigger, right? They can get almost to an inch, whereas these are, you know, not quite 2/3 that. All right. So why am I interested in the bumblebees? As I mentioned, they propagate a lot of our native plants, but they are extremely more efficient, okay? They can visit probably 2 to 6 to 10 times more flowers than a honeybee in the given same amount of time. They're quicker, but there's a couple other things that's going on. Bumblebees can detach their wings from the muscles in their thorax and shiver them to create heat. And they have to create 86 degrees, 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, because they sit on their eggs and they sit on the brood to help them develop. And every time they leave, that kind of slows things down. And a queen will have to visit, it's estimated, about 6,000 flowers a day to keep the brood warm. So it's quite an amazing task. So they generate heat, which means they can be out longer during the day and have a longer season. They're faster, right? So all these things contribute. Oh, and the most important thing, for you that love your tomatoes, the buzz pollination, right? Tomatoes have to have buzz pollination to shake loose the pollen. So tomatoes and relatives and cranberries, blueberries are all, they use bumblebees for fertilization. Excuse me, pollination, followed by, thank you, Irene, keep me in line. So here's where I say they're economically important, and they pollinate a lot of crops. So I wrote the state, Jennifer Lund at the state, she's the apiarist for the state of Maine, and I asked about, you know, are any introduced bees being used, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, not to her knowledge, it's against federal regulations to bring in any foreign bees, but the common eastern bumblebee since 1986 has been bred, and they create colonies. There's 2 companies, a Belgian company and a Dutch company. One's called BioBest, the other is called Koppert, K-O-P-P-E-R-T, and they make these colonies. They call them quads. There are 4 colonies in a box that you can actually pick up and move around. And she says, all the growers I know in Maine are using Bombus impatiens, that's the common eastern. We don't have a good estimate for how many are sold in Maine, but places like Backyard Farms, they're greenhouse tomato growers, use bumblebee quads exclusively for the greenhouse pollination and get regular shipments throughout the year. Many of the smaller berry, including blueberry and mixed fruit vegetable growers, producers also use bumblebee quads for pollination. So they're breeding a native bee, but it does lead to the chance of introducing disease to the wild population, so that can be an issue. So anyway, so we have 48 species north of Mexico, 33 species east of the Rocky Mountains. And I want to mention, before I forget, if you are at all interested in doing any of the online stuff, Ohio State, if you do the Ohio State University Bee Lab, they've offered 3 free courses. 2 are on pollinators, 1 on bumblebees, and all those lectures are posted. And some of these are world experts, like Jamie Strange, who is a virologist, or for bumblebees. And anyway, it's out there, and a lot of and I mentioned earlier, so let me mention it again, or before we started. There is a nice guide out there, a color guide called Eastern Bumblebees. Did I say Eastern Bumblebees? And it's a USDA publication. If you Google it, it's a PDF that you can download to your computer or your phone. So if you need that, I have it written down somewhere. So anyway, bumblebees, large mass, hairy body, vegetarians, as I mentioned. They have the pollen basket. No other bee will have the pollen basket on their hind leg. And these are creatures of cooler climates. Now, they are in Africa, but they're in the Atlas Mountains, right? And you will see them in Asia, but usually it's generally cooler. So the ones that, according to the literature, and I've done a lot of literature review this last month or 2, according to the literature, it's the higher elevation ones that everybody's really worried about, because they're the ones that are getting pushed out of a habitat. The lower ones can move up to cooler climes, but the ones that are in the Arctic or higher elevations, they're the ones that might be in jeopardy. Okay, so questions, in case, because I know I can talk, so. Yes, ma'am.
Tell us how the pollen basket works. I had no clue.
Yeah, so it's a little hard to see all the leg parts, but femur, tibia, tarsus, okay? This tarsus segment is big and the rest of it is small. That's how I know it's a bee. Mm-hmm. The pollen basket is here, but what you don't see is there's an indentation, and it's surrounded by hairs that are branched hairs, and they just stuff it, so they'll be raking pollen from them and stuffing it, stuffing it, stuffing it. Right, and then when they get back to the colony, they'll take that off, scrape that off, and then the workers will be using it and making pollen balls, which we'll talk about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, other bees will have pollen on their body, and a lot of them have on their bottom of their abdomen. They'll be stuffing pollen there. You'll see a lot of those in the summer. Anything else? All right. So I thought I'd do some lookalikes, because it's, things are moving quick, right? And I'm still trying to track bumblebees. I haven't mastered that they don't leave too many footprints. So, and I don't have the sensory ability to follow the pheromones. But some of the things, now I apologize, one of these isn't mine, because I saw some of these this summer, but did I photograph it? No, I'll show you in a minute. So the other thing I wanted to show you, check this out. This is a common eastern bumblebee. The flower's not even open. And they're going after pollen or nectar, probably nectar. And the other thing is, Joanne asked about the pollen basket. In the spring, when you see the queens, when you see them putting pollen in the pollen basket, you know then they have a colony. If there's no pollen in the pollen basket, they're still looking and they're still feeding. and we'll talk about the life cycle. Remember the clearwing moth, sphinx moths that were out a couple years ago? This was all over my house in South Pearly Brook and up on Shred Hill. But it's really fuzzy looking, but the wings are clear. And then here's a fly. Now I apologize, I didn't get a good headshot, but see how fuzzy it is? But as you know, with moths and butterflies, they have pretty pronounced antennae, but there's usually a knob on the end, and you won't see that with bumblebees at all. And then with flies, I think this is a pointer, you see those tiny little antennae? They always look kind of forked, and their eyes are huge and close together. And also their legs are usually pretty skinny. But one pair of wings only. Flies, all flies have one pair of wings. But the antennae usually, and the big eyes usually give it away. And then I saw these all down in North Carolina. Did I take a picture of one? So I had to borrow one from the web. But this is a carpenter bee. And carpenter bees, notice, really hairless abdomen. There's no hair on the abdomen. It's not a bumblebee. It's a carpenter bee, similar kind of lifestyle, but they're wood eaters. They chew wood. So, and other things, obviously pollen and nectar, but they usually bore into wood for their colony. So a number of things that we're concerned about in terms of bumblebees, or we, I should say they, habitat loss and pesticides, and I started those because I thought that's something that we can control, like not using insecticides, even fungicides. There's literature showing that fungicides will affect bumblebee fungi in their gut and things like that. So even other chemicals, oh, plus the carrier, you don't know what the carrier is doing. So insecticides are really killers of most beneficial insects. But habitat loss is a big thing, and that's something we can do about it. As I mentioned, the disease and parasite stuff wasn't really a big issue until we started putting out quad sets and taking confined bees out into the wild and spreading it. But it seems to be at a low level. There was also some concern about our honeybees spreading disease to the native bees. And I did run across 2 articles, but it was really a low rate of transmission. And you know, they're even studying the shape of the flower to see what kind of flower shape would transmit, because you know, as you have feces on the flower from any bee, is the other bee going to be picking up virus or some of these other bacterial or other diseases? And they found that flat, wide flowers actually were the worst type of flowers to spread disease to bumblebees, which you would think it'd be long tubular ones. That's what I thought. But so competition for food, for sure. But the competition in terms of pushing them out of an area is probably legitimate. Climate change is being looked at, and I can tell you I can tell you I read at least 6 articles that looked at temperature. Temperature definitely affects bumblebees to the point. So they need to generate 30 degrees C, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, right, to fly. And that's why bees will be eating nectar, 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 just for their flight muscles and other functions, right? But at 32 degrees C, which I should have translated, was that closer to 90, 92 something maybe? That affects their ability to go out and forage. And the bees that do go out and forage at higher, so they're exposed to a high temperature for a short time, it does affect their foraging. So there's at least 3 to 6 studies that I read that clearly show temperature is a problem for the bumblebees, because they're cooler climate animals. All right, wrong button. So I thought you might be interested in this. This was a study by the Natural History Museum looking at where the concentration of bumblebees were. And they believe that the origin of the bumblebee is actually from maybe the Himalaya area in Asia. And as I said, you know, they spread all over the world, but mostly the bigger numbers are where it's cooler climates. So there's basically 20,000 species of bee. That does not include the wasp. right? The wasp group. But 250 worldwide of bombus, and as I said, 33 east of the Mississippi, or east of the Rockies. No, I said Mississippi, didn't I? Okay, so what about here? So this is from all the work that's been done so far. Unfortunately, it's only been posted up to 2017. There's one guy doing all the IDs, so it's taking a while. There's a fantastic couple from Van Buren. I didn't get permission to use their name. I forgot to call and ask, so I don't want to say their name. But they've done probably the majority of collecting in all these towns up here in the valley. That's me in the green with a bunch of other people, including the couple from Van Buren. Dr. Kim Borges was in collecting in St. John. My apologies, I went to Eagle Lake in 2020, 1B, because we had that drought. 1B. So I feel bad I didn't really do the job there. But anyway, we have 17 bees statewide. In 2017, there were 12 bees found in the St. John Valley. Just looking at Van Buren to Allagash down to Eagle Lake. I did do Cross Lake, okay? So 12 bees and what I thought I would do is show you the top 5, because some of them look a lot alike. They're hard to tell, but I think these top 5 you'd be able to tell apart. So, and apologies for this, I took this picture and almost discarded it because I thought it was a common eastern, and as I was going through my pictures I realized it's not. So this is up on Charette Hill. I have a little azalea there. There's 2 bands of yellow, can be white or yellow. There's 2 bands of yellow and 1 little black spot, so it has like a fur coat with a spot, and 2 bands on the abdomen. This is a half black bumblebee. Okay, and I didn't realize I had this because they're moving so fast, and it's not a great picture. There were 144. There were 565 bumblebees sampled in 2017 in the St. John Valley. 144 were half black. Now keep in mind, these numbers year to year can change. Some years are going to favor one over another. One of my favorites, the tricolor bumblebee. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. 160 some, 144 was the tricolor. That was the second most sampled. Really easy to identify. Yellow, orange, yellow, and this can be white as well, and black. Tricolor. And just a little coat or a covering of yellow on the thorax. So tricolor. That one's an easy one to identify. This is another one. One of my favorites is, it's Bombus borealis. I just love that name. It's northern amber bumblebee. Although the abdomen is extended, this is all yellow. There's just a band of black across here, black hairs, but these are mostly all yellow hairs. And this is actually on Lee Terrio's property in the clover field. And here you can see where the pollen basket might be if that was a female. And I can't tell because it's not a perfect picture, but I suspect that that's a female, that's recessed, because it doesn't look like there's a lot of hairs there. But it was in August, so the males are out in August. It's a little harder to tell. But these are really cool bumblebees. And I think there were 80, what did I say, 160, 140, 86, something like 60 of these. I had to borrow this because I did not have a picture. This is the yellow banded. 2 bands of yellow between the black bands. So there's 1 band of black, 2 yellow, the rest is black. Usually 6 abdominal segments that you can clearly see, even though there may be more. And then, as you can see, are just a little neck yellow right behind the top of the thorax. So that's the yellow banded. And then the last one is the common eastern. There were only about 40 of these that were sampled in 2017. And 1 band of yellow. That's why I confused it with that first one. So those are the top 5 from 2017.
When you say sampled, are you capturing them?
Yeah, so these were photographed, but in 2017, all the volunteers that went out in the state went out and we were using urine cups. So you go up to a flower, you have the cup lid in your hand, and go up to the flower with the bumblebee, and as it starts to back out, you catch it. They get mad at first, but I don't know anybody that's been stung by them. They do have a stinger, and it can make quite a dent, but I don't know that there's no known allergies to bees. I'm not talking about wasp, I'm talking the real bees. But they say the people that are working in greenhouses with them, that are rearing them, have developed some allergies. But if you think about it, their resources are really limited. It's not like a bear is going to go after a little hive like that, because there's not a lot of protein as opposed to a big wasp nest or honeybee nest. But anyway, going back to your question, refresh my memory.
Well, so you capture it in the cup.
Yes.
And then you ID it and you take it back with you? Or
So what they would have us do, people that didn't want to kill them could cool them off, slow them down, and take pictures. But you have to, there's the joint here, and the distance between the eyes, the length of the jaw, all those things that they need, side and face shots, to properly identify it. So you could submit those if you didn't want to kill them. So I would wait till the queens were done and I started to see the workers, usually around June. So I'd be watching. The queens are the big ones. And then as soon as you start seeing the next size coming out, because queen is all by herself feeding the young. So the first set of workers usually are small. Once I would start seeing them, I would start to sample. And I would, if it was up in a tree, I would use a net and then put them into a urine cup with the lid, holes punched in it, and they would be in a cooler until I got home, and then I would put them gently in the freezer and they would go to sleep and die. And you'd leave them in there at least a day, not more than 2-3 days, and then you would take them out, let them thaw out. Then you would mount them on a piece of foam and in a box that would go to the state with a bunch of, you had the temperature, how many clouds in the sky, percentage of cloud cover, what plant were they on. That was absolutely critical. What plant were they feeding on? So that was good because it made me identify a lot of things I wasn't sure of. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff. Time of day, et cetera, et cetera. And everything's numbered, right? So you had to be really careful not to mess anything up. And they call them vouchers. Insect people that do these collections are called vouchers. So there were some people, I guess, that did photographic vouchers, but I found it easier just to wait till the queens were done, and then I was not killing a whole colony by doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Is everyone using the same technique?
Yes. So in 2016, they had a training at UMaine.
Right.
So it was UMaine Farmington, the state, the Xerxes Society, which is a bee people, I think they were involved as well, and the feds were also funding it. So they sent us home with our bug nets and our urine cups and all kinds of stuff.
And the numbers that you mentioned, are those numbers associated with the St. John Valley, or
yes.
Is that the state of, okay.
The 17 species was the state of Maine, but the 565 that were sampled were just the St. John Valley.
Okay.
Right. Yes, sir.
And when you mentioned numbers like 160 and 130, that's how many?
Yes, how many they identified that were caught and sent in for identification, right?
Okay.
And I suspect most of those were sampled.
How many years have they been sampling for?
They did 26, well, some of the state employees went out in 2015 to kind of get a feel for things, but the project really started in 2016 and went to 2019, but they asked us if you were interested. There are all these towns that haven't been done yet. Would you mind going to, so that's when I went to Eagle Lake during the drought year.
And are they continuing year after year?
No, we're still waiting for the ID of, no, it was really just supposed to be a 4-year project, but I think we got a pretty good sense for a lot of towns what was there. But you can see where the gaps are, But most of the populated towns, it's pretty good coverage. Surprised Caribou doesn't have much. But in 2018 or 2019 or 2020, there may be data. We just haven't gotten that yet. Anything else? Appreciate the questions. So anyway, those are the top 5 that we have in the valley. Okay, so anyway, Pauline, recognize that flower? You gave it to us. So I'm using this, not that I see bumblebees on it, but this geranium that Pauline was kind enough to give Janine and I wanted you to see because we're talking, for those of you that, and forgive me, I'm not, you probably know this better than I do. So the pollen is one of the food sources for bees, right? And then there's also nectar. And we'll talk more about that. But I wanted you to see the pollen on an anther, and then this is the pistil. So the ovary and the fruit's going to be down in there. And each one of these portions of it has to get pollen, hopefully from another flower, another plant, for cross-pollination, and that's what the insects are doing. But the bees are interested in the pollen for food and also the nectar. And I wanted to show you this. So this is my neighbor's pumpkin patch. And here you can see a common eastern bumblebee, and there's a nectary. There's probably another one here you just can't see. And the bumblebee's feeding on that, but this is a male flower for pumpkin in my neighbor's yard. And so anyway, just so you can see where the nectary is, that's what they're going after. It's interesting because sometimes bees will cheat for the, let's say you're a short-jawed bumblebee, there's long-jawed, medium, and short. They'll go to the back of the flower and bite into it to get the nectar, and it's called nectar robbing. Ants will do that too because ants are small enough they can bypass the pollen. Anyway, just so that's what they're interested in. The pollen and the nectar are really important, and I'll explain more why. So here is, this is in my backyard, but I have a wild blueberry back there. So they're earlier than the domestic blueberries. And you can see the grass is brown there. So this is a queen. It's a little hard to see where her pollen basket is, but it would be here. And she's just come out, she's flying, and she's feeding on nectar. So in order to fly, they need to be at 86 degrees. So if it's not warm out, she will be sucking on eating nectar, and then she'll shiver to get her temperature up. And now what she's going to do, oh, and also, and I should tell you if I slip, the bumblebee people call these gynes, G-Y-N-E-S, because they don't want to confuse it with the egg-laying queen the next spring. So when they're talking, the gyne is the fall future queen. So future queen works too. So she is going to be eating pollen because pollen will then, in the spring, start to her egg development and ovary initiation, right? And we'll get to the mating and everything that happens in the fall, but I thought I'd start in the spring. So she's eating pollen to kind of get the ovaries going, feeding on nectar so she has energy to fly, and now she's happy she's going to start, and you'll see this every spring. They're low to the ground, searching back and forth, stop, they'll go investigate something, come back out. And if it's a site that seems pretty good, they're going to take their time. If it's a site that's not so good, like sometimes a pasture might not be good, they'll go quicker, and you can kind of tell that. So here, there's not a lot of research, right? So it's hard for me to find stuff on some of our bees, but what I do know is the ones that I have in my yard are all underground nesters that I see going for nectar in my yard. So the 3 that I have very commonly in my neighborhood have been the common eastern. They're there the longest. The tricolor seems to have a shorter season, comes out later, disappears sooner. And then my neighbor's field just down the way from me is the northern amber bumblebee, all underground nesters, okay? So bumblebees in general will go after tufts of grass, rotten logs, but they're mostly looking, they're smelling for rodent holes. Because the rodents have already stuffed it full of debris, and they don't have, this is a very short season. These bees live 1 year. So with that debris already there, they don't have to gather that like a bird would have to, right, to make a nest. So it saves them time. And apparently they can smell the mouse. So one of the tricks that some of these people that are trying to do artificial nest, they'll take mouse droppings and put it out there. It's pretty smart, you know. Whether it's the droppings or the urine or whatever, I don't know much about inside the mouse nest. What it is that attracts them, I don't know. But anyway, she is going to be searching, and then when she finds the nest, she'll build a nest. So what she'll do is take those discarded materials, then she'll start eating nectar, and collecting nectar and pollen. And what's going to happen is they can produce wax off their abdomen, and she'll make a wax pot that they call a honey pot. And she's going to regurgitate the nectar into that, and that's going to be her feed when she's sitting on the eggs and on the young. So the honey pot. Then she's going to make a pollen ball. She's going to press that pollen together. She'll take saliva and nectar and coat that. There's some thinking that the saliva has antibacterial or antibiotic properties. It's probably true. And she's going to coat that, and then what she'll do is once that honey pot is filled with nectar, she'll go ahead and lay some eggs. She'll lay anywhere from 4 to 16 eggs right on the top of the pollen ball, and then she will sit there and incubate them for 4 days. Then they will hatch, and she's going to then try her best to keep coming back. She'll go out and eat, come back, and sit on the pollen ball to keep the young warm. 86 degrees, they develop well. If she's away, the development slows down. Okay, so they're going to feed, and then they'll reach a stage where they're going to pupate. They're going to go into the resting stage. They build a cocoon around themselves, and then 10 days, 2 weeks later, out comes a worker. And now she has some help. So now the colony's having a chance to start to develop and to grow. So she'll lay on the eggs, 4 days they hatch. They'll start feeding on the pollen right away. Like I said, they're just little maggot-like. I like to call them white grubs. And they're just eating machines. So the workers will emerge. And again, a lot of times those first workers will be smaller, so they're easy for us to identify from the queen. And they'll help her. They'll start to go forage. And there's studies that have shown the first they go out to forage, they're going to actually specialize. Some are just going after nectar, others are just going after pollen. Or a lot of times it's nectar and pollen because they need to fly. And they'll be coming back, they'll be helping to feed the queen. She'll be laying eggs, and then there's going to be, once the colony gets bigger and bigger, there's going to be workers that are just in there helping her. Some are foraging, some are just inside helping the queen take care of the young, including incubating. So there's going to be more and more honey pots, and foragers will be coming in to fill those so that the workers and the queen have something to eat. It's really fascinating stuff. Colony gets bigger and bigger, and then this is what a handsome, well-organized bumblebee nest looks like. It looks like chaos, doesn't it? And somebody somehow uncovered this, and you'll see this is a wax cover that would have enclosed the whole thing. And here you can see these are probably pupa. And then here are some old pupal cases which are also can then be used as honey pots. Okay? Doesn't look like much, does it? But it's pretty chaotic looking, but it's somehow they are successful. Yes, sir?
A wild question for a guy that fishes and sometimes steps in a hole that gets a bee sting. So that's what I've done. I've stepped on a nest.
Yeah, and they usually...
It always used to baffle me because I'd look around in the air and see where's the bee.
Well, and that could be a wasp nest more than a bumblebee, because these will tend to be underground, 1 to 3 feet.
Oh.
But it is possible. It is possible that maybe the covering was thinned, but they will sting if you're messing with their nest.
Yeah.
That's the one time people will say definitely.
Yeah.
But more than likely, was it August also?
Oh, I don't know.
Because you know how in August...
took charge of the month I got paid.
Okay.
Whoever went mud that way.
So anyway, now we're into late summer, going into the fall, and nobody knows what triggers this. It's not clear, but what's really interesting is the queen will start producing future queens, which they call gynes, G-Y-N-E-S, and males, but they're not sure what triggers it. And the queens, the gynes, are fertilized eggs. All the workers are fertilized eggs, and I'll come to that in a minute. The males are unfertilized eggs. Okay? And so the queen is going to be producing them. The gynes, the new queens, will go out and feed during the day, but come back into the colony at night. The males are out having a party and looking for girls.
Nothing.
And, well, they're doing one very important thing. So at some point, and research has shown that somewhere in between 6 to 10 days when a gyne is produced, somewhere in there, 6 to 10 days is optimal for her to mate. And the males will do a couple of things, which I'll talk a little bit more when we talk about our own bees in the area. But most of the time they'll patrol looking for a female from another colony, and they can smell each other, and each colony has its own. They have these wax esters that their labial glands will produce, and they can, apparently those wax esters are different with the queens, smells a little different, then the workers smell a little different, and the males smell different, and they can tell whose colony you're from or not. So, but that's about it, right? So the males, if they do find, and they will drop pheromone trail, they patrol, they'll drop a pheromone trail, and if they find a female and attach to her, they're going to stay 10 to 80 minutes. The females will only mate one time, but by staying on the female 10 to 80 minutes, it gives the chance for the sperm to harden. And then the next year, as she's laying eggs, she controls the sperm fertilizing the eggs. That's under her control that next spring. But then what happens now is we get into the fall. The males are going to be, all of you that are gardeners have seen this. On your sunflowers, all those male bumblebees, that's what they are, they're the males. They're all hanging out, either trying to get nectar or wait until they unthaw from that first, second, third frost. The gynes, soon after, and I haven't been able to get a little bit of detail on this, but soon after they mate, they're going to go find wintering headquarters. So they'll go down 2-3 inches into some soft soil. And unfortunately, I saw a gyne, I assumed it was a gyne going in to my neighbor's garden area, and I thought, lady, you are done, because he's going to plow that. And, you know, so one of the things is, I know I have done it. I'm sure I'm damaging some queens because I'm, you know, pulling weeds and doing stuff. So anyway, she's going to overwinter, and then the cycle starts over in the spring. And I have to tell you, I want to thank Dr. Jeremy Herberger, University of Wisconsin. He was very generous, and he knows that this is going to be on YouTube. And he was very generous in letting me use this. Plus, if you haven't been over to the library, a lot of these photos are in the library display. And he was very generous in letting me use it there as well. So I appreciate that. Really decent guy. So here is our common eastern bumblebee in blueberry season, look at how bright yellow that is. So I know that's not clover. Common eastern bumblebee, up to 400 bees in a colony. She can lay up to 2,000 eggs. About 50% are going to die. Or I should say 50% aren't going to make it to adult. In 2010, Dr. Jamie Strange, Oregon State, did a study. I was really curious to find out, what's the success rate? And although this doesn't translate perfectly, in his study, he captured queens so he could gynes in the fall, so he could follow them, and then he watched their colony develop. Only 16.7% successfully produced gynes for the next generation. So it's not a great success rate. So anyway, this is common eastern, can up to 400 individuals at the peak of the season, okay? These workers, okay, it's 4 to 5 weeks for you to have an adult worker. And then she's only going to last about a month foraging. And you can always look, if you look at their wings, the more torn up they are, the older they are. But they only last about a week, so their life cycle's just over, for the workers, is only about two months and some. So anyway, these will patrol. So they're going to be flying a patrol looking for females from another colony. What else did I want to say? Oh, the other thing, this one is the one that's been bred commercially, so there's a lot of research on this. This bumblebee has been known, and I'm sure it's true with a lot of our others, they call it trap lining. So think about trapping. And they like to go on a straight line. They like, roughly, right? They like to go through the resources and stay on the same kind of plant. And what they'll do is they'll come back the next time and go straight where they were before to go through the stuff that's already used up to the next set so they can keep track. And it's called trap lining. Yes, sir?
When you talk about the workers, you mentioned that they are females?
Yes.
And can they also be males or no?
No. The only time the males...
They're workers that won't become queen bees.
Correct.
Right.
Yep. And what happens exactly to produce a queen, the gyne in the colony for the next year, has to do with the feeding. I don't have a good handle on that yet, but it has to do with how they're fed. And one of the things they're fed is honey. So honey is going to be, well, a lot of the workers are fed honey too. So honey is pollen and nectar and enzymes all mixed together. What's the word I'm trying to look for? Not enzymes. Saliva. Thank you, Doc. Appreciate it. Yeah, all mixed together, that's the honey. But the workers are fed that too. But like I said, a lot of the triggering of what goes on isn't completely understood yet. So common eastern bumblebee, tricolor bumblebee, same thing. They live underground. The males will patrol for females, but their colonies only get to about 200 individuals at the peak. And these are earlier and later. These are a little later in the spring, and they disappear. I didn't see any of these late September, October. These I saw through the middle of October. The third one is the Northern Amber bumblebee. What's interesting about them, same idea. I couldn't find any colony size information on them, but the males, when they're produced, they will search for another colony and sit outside just waiting at the door. So it's a whole different strategy, but I thought that's pretty clever. So there's the life cycle in case you have any other questions. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, this is a short segment talking about one of the successful failed experiments that I had, and my apologies again to my wife, who's going to have to see the ugly part of the yard that I usually have disguised so she can't see it because she hates it. But anyway, she puts up with me. Thanks, Janine. I want to look at some of favorable plants what you folks may know more than I. I want to talk about No Mow May, which was actually in the paper not even a month ago. Bee lawns, bee yards, flower gardens, and some of the things we could be thinking about doing for all the pollinators. So spring for bumblebees, well actually I think for all bees, but particularly bumblebees, is really a tough time. Because early on, I mean, what do you see? Maybe willow and coltsfoot, right? And then you might get into some dandelions. But in terms of native stuff, the violets, the blueberries, trout lily, apple, chokecherry, I have not seen any bumblebees on crocus, but it's in the literature that they're on crocus. In fact, I haven't seen them on Monarda bee balm. I've only seen hummingbirds on bee balm. So I don't know. But anyway, the spring is really tough. Anything you can do in the spring is going to help bumblebees big time. So at any rate, that's spring. Summer, there's a lot going on for bumblebees. And clover, again, the Monarda or, thank you, bee balm. The impatiens, touch me not. And then raspberries. Boy, any raspberries are just loaded with bumblebees anytime I see them. It's a good collecting spot. So yeah, sorry, this is out of focus from the camera. But summer is not too bad a time. And then you get into late summer and fall, you have the goldenrod, and that is a big one for bumblebees. Asters, I'm still trying to narrow that down because I planted a yard full of asters. Haven't seen a bumblebee on them yet, but there could be a couple things at play. It's a little shaded there, and also I might have the wrong aster. There's plenty of them. Thistle, Joe Pye weed, the bee balm again, and dwarf dandelion, which they were on well into October in my yard. Now this is a close-up, so obviously it's not that big. So let's start with No Mow May. So No Mow May actually started in England, and then it got picked up in the Midwest. I think it was Minnesota. And what it is if you can delay mowing your lawn to allow the dandelions to feed the bees, the pollinators, that's the idea. So here's my backyard. You can see the phlox is flowering. That was another mistake I made. That thing is all over the place. But here you can see my lawn with the dandelions. And definitely bees using it. So No Mow May. So even if you don't want to leave your yard with dandelions for a long time, even if you delay a little bit, you're still going to be helping to feed them. So that's a big thing. And some of the towns in Maine are actually introducing legislation. Bangor was in the paper, right?
Quebec has that.
And Quebec has it? Okay. So it really helps the pollinators. And then there are other seasons. So in my yard, my wife winces at this, but I have hawkweed that will flower, and I also have, this is the dwarf dandelion in August, September. So there are other seasons you can do it. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't go back when it starts to go to seed and mow it really low, which I do, you know, to take the seed out. But this is October 1st. This is that my neighbor Peter found a colony between us in a diversion ditch, and this is one of the common eastern bumblebees that was from that colony, and she's feeding on the dwarf dandelion in my backyard. So anyway, this is my septic field, and where you see the tree line up there, see how I have cleverly hidden that from my wife? So please don't tell her, because you're going to see that coming up. So I had been reading from University of Minnesota. If you're interested in bee lawns, just Google University of Minnesota bee lawns, or call me or email me, and I'll be happy to send you some literature. But I had an issue with water in my basement, and my drainage tile had been completely compromised. So I had to have that all redone. So the side yard, it was done late in the fall, so the side yards I seeded right away, but I saved the backyard for the summer so I could do a bee lawn. And what the University of Minnesota recommends is a low-growing fescue, Dutch white clover, which is lower white lower growing white clover, creeping thyme, and self-heal. Now the problem with self-heal is finding the seed. I got it from Asia. You may not want to do that. Also, it didn't do well. And it is a native. It is a native plant. So I seeded that. This is in the summer. I seeded it in the spring, and watering was really important, keeping the water. But the problem was my local contractor, excellent guy, really honest and fair, but his soil was horrible. So I ended up getting stony clay. Yeah. So I thought, oh my God, this experiment's not going to go anywhere. But guess what?
What?
Man, it didn't stop the clover.
Your clover's gonna do well in your clay.
So anyway, this is at the end of the first season. You see the patches here. And I took out the self-heal because it didn't germinate really well at all. But where those patches are is going to be creeping thyme. So the clover and the fescue is there, but the clover pretty much dominated. And then this is the following year, but I didn't mow. I was trying to let it really seed in. And you can see the stony areas, but it's been covered. And then this is when I started mowing the next year. This is year 3, so I'm mowing. And this is right before my next mow. Okay, I'm getting ready to mow this. It was like a week or 2. And this is the creeping thyme. You can see the Dutch white clover there. So I mow it, and it doesn't look like there's much there, but if you look closely, creeping thyme, clover, 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 it's there, right? It's better than just all sod, which really isn't very natural, unless you want to golf. So anyway, even though my soil was horrible, this really worked out. The trick is mowing at 3 inches. That's the trick. Unfortunately, my mower only goes to 2.5 inches, or I'd have a little bit more flower. But the other thing you can do is, if you can't mow, you could delay a couple of days, and I know that's not always easy. So anyway, there's all kinds of ways around this. So even though the soil was horrible, it really still worked out. I was pleased about that. Okay, Janine, no look. So bee yard. Now, you can tell I'm not a landscaper. So I planted anything that I'd find up on the woodlot or wild in the yard. Like all my, you're going to see my goldenrod. It's really right from my yard, put down in here. So with permission from the neighbors, okay, I do a strip of grass over here so that it's not going into their fence, and they're okay. Well, at least they put up with me. And so there's not much to be seen here in June, but in July, some St. John's wort, and Bumble Bees love it, the St. John's wort. This is not the native one, though. I don't think this is the introduced one, I think. And you can see it's late in July because I'm starting to get some black-eyed Susans. And then in August, and this is minor because I will triple the amount of goldenrod in here in a couple days for sure. And then in September, my aster, which this thing has gone really well because it has rhizomes. So I just transplant the rhizomes and it does pretty well. So what I'm doing here is I'm not mowing except once a year because otherwise I'll have trees in there. And down at the bottom you'll see a stump, and that was a Norway maple that one of the previous owners had planted, and I would get tens of thousands of seed from that. And so anyway, I took that out and provided a little more sun in there. But so anyway, that's a bee yard. Now I'll tell you, if you go to the Ohio State lectures on the pollinators, the free lectures that they posted, you're going to see landscapers doing this really classy with walkways and native plants, but they look like it looks like it's a horticultural garden. So anyway, that's my approach. Again, please don't tell my wife. And then anything you can do with flowers, and obviously not native, right? Although linden, this is little leaf linden, you could argue this isn't native either. The bees love this though, don't they? I mean, 2 weeks of absolute unbelievable smell in your yard. It's just so fragrant, a plant. I've not seen any bumblebees on the crocus, but I have seen sweat bees, some of those little metallic bees on them. The bellflower, one of the most invasive plants in my yard. Be careful with this. But boy, do they love this plant. And then the monarda we talked about. And then the liatris, blazing star, they love that as well. That's another one. So not native, well, there is a wild monarda, but not native, but they are providing at least nectar, maybe pollen. Here's the problem with introduced plants. Native plants, the bees have evolved with them. The nectar and the pollen do have toxins. And so they may not collect pollen from a plant if they know it's not right for them, if you know what I mean. And honestly, all the literature you read about this bumblebee, this is the preferred list of plants, that's all a lot of guesswork. It's observation, but only last year did they actually start the first study in Ohio, and they're looking for volunteers, and you volunteer to go out and follow bumblebee and see what they're feeding on, and are they feeding on pollen or nectar, and report that. And you're supposed to do transects. So really, a lot of this is speculation, or I shouldn't say speculation. It's from observation, but it's not purely documented. What time of year, and are they going after pollen or nectar? Because that's still not clear. So native plants give you the advantage that the bumblebee has evolved with that and probably can tolerate the toxins in the pollen, which they're going to feed to their young. That's the real take home. And then, of course, the sunflowers. And there was a study on sunflowers in addition to wild plants, natural habitat with flowering plants, supplemented with sunflower feeding, and it really boosted the success of the colonies that they studied, which is interesting. So anyway, this was the 1st of October. We had already had a couple of frosts, and you can see these are all males hanging out, trying to stay alive. A few of them didn't make it, but.
Dave, how large was your patch of ground you showed us?
Which one, Larry? The garden or the yard?
The yard.
That is 1/10 of an acre, maybe at the most. Yeah.
So if we've got a corner on our property, we can.
Anything, even a couple of plants is going to help. Anything. There's been a number of studies. The most recent one I read, there was 2 recent ones that I read. The more sun, the more diversity of plants, the larger the garden, the least disease transmission for bumblebees, the more diversity of pollinators you're going to have. And sun seemed to be an important component.
And your piece there where you asked your neighbors for permission?
It's 2 swaths, maybe 6 feet.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, so I didn't want to be up against their fence to make them look bad, so, but they were okay if I let the rest of it go. Anything else?
Is that the Norway maple?
Yes. So I decided to turn it into habitat. So anyway, one of the things you can do is drill holes. The recommended is these diameters. 5/32 seems to work for my neighbor really well. 5 to 6 inches deep. And this isn't for bumblebees. This is for mason bees and woodcutter bees, that kind of thing. So this has been up 2 to 3 years, no takers. Problem is it's on the side of my shed, no flowers anywhere near. There's a blueberry patch that the bumblebees usually take care of. This was just this one season. And what I did was 1/8 5/30 seconds and 1/4 inch, and no takers yet. But my neighbor had a lot of success with 5/30 seconds, but right in his garden, flower garden. And he had, I don't know, I'm assuming they were mason bees. I don't think they were woodcutter bees, because I could just see where they had plugged up the hole. That's how you'll know there will be either mud or paper or leaf material, chewed up leaf material blocking it. And what they do is they go in, they lay their eggs, they make a cell, they lay an egg, they make a cell, they lay an egg, they make a cell. The males usually come out first. And then, you know, so anyway, that can help. But like I say, I think my failure on this one is I just didn't have it close enough to any resource. And so anyway, delay in the mowing in the spring, avoid any pesticides, that's a huge one. And like I said, fungicides as well can be affecting bumblebees or any of the other pollinators. The bee lawn, using native plants, wild areas anywhere you can. And this is one of my failures, is the fall ground disturbance, because I'm trying to get my garden ready for the next season, and it's my flower garden. So I'm disturbing that, and I'm sure there's probably queens in there. So if you do that and you do dig up a queen, you can try to bury her back, and hopefully she didn't get squished. But the other thing is, for those of you that are interested in those solitary bees, bless you, the solitary bees, you can leave cut stems, and they will use the cut stems for their brood. So they'll lay, instead of having it horizontal like the drilled holes, you can use a stem, and they recommend 8-inch. So these are the hollow, like your hollow flower stems. If you can stand that in your garden. So anyway, with that, I appreciate you being here, especially on a stormy night. Any questions? Yes, sir, Matt?
Do the bumblebees produce propolis like honeybees do?
I don't know that, Matt. I'm not sure that they do. I have not read that at all. You mean to feed the queen, right?
Well, that or hive, like building a hive. Kind of like that resin glue that holds everything together.
All I know is they refer to it as a wax. That's all I've read. I have not read any other chemical term or other terminology. But again, even though I've gone through a year's worth of literature, I'm not sure that I'm certain I haven't hit a lot of things. Yes, sir.
I know that my bees, the first thing that they collect from are the maple trees and poplars.
Oh, yeah.
And so they use that pollen. Do the bumblebees use any tree pollens? I didn't see anything listed in here.
That's a good question.
That comes first.
Yeah. Well, they use willow, if you want to count willow as a tree.
Yeah.
Sorry, foresters.
Maple is first for them.
Yeah. Oh, I can see why. Well, aspen is one of the first flowering trees anyway.
Yeah.
I haven't seen bumblebees on that, and I haven't seen much in the literature.
But that's way up high.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, is anybody looking?
Yeah.
Because I don't know if I've said this to you. I think I've said it to Matt. When I was at Michigan State, they put me in an office with the bee people, and they were interesting. And one of the professors there told me in his studies, the plant per acre that produces the most honey for the bees, nectar for the bees, is linden.
Yep.
And so anyway, but I didn't get any linden honey. I have to work on that one. But on my little leaf linden, man, every critter in the world is on that tree. Sir?
We got a burdock patch.
Yeah.
Maybe that's where we should start our bee lawn.
No, our flower garden is going to be our bee lawn. Right? Just don't touch it.
See, we
Well, you could do that, sure. Yeah.
caused a little feud already.
Well, I'm waiting to see what happens when I get home. Now that she's seen it close up.
My yard won't be the same either.
Yes, ma'am.
I have one of those solitary bee things with little holes, and some of them they have little mud patches.
Yeah, neat.
Now, others had like little twigs sticking out of them. What's going on?
Little twigs?
Yeah.
Boy, you know, this is going to sound weird. I wonder if that was a bird trying to feed, using the twig. I don't know. I don't know for sure. Because some birds, like crows, are pretty clever. And mine, I didn't tell you this, but every year, every fall, some creature, and I don't know if it was a squirrel or I suspect it was a blue jay probably, I don't know, has cleaned out all those. So if you looked at my, this was a spruce that I cut that was hollowed out. And so what I did is I went around the yard and cut stems. Some were hollow and some are not for spacers. And so I stuffed this with 6-inch hollow stems every season. Somebody keeps cleaning that out every fall. And
The stems?
yeah, they just pull that out, and it's either a bird or some creature is doing that. I'm sure it's not the millions of moles that I have in my yard this year. Have you seen the moles?
Maybe if you need.
Cow. Oh.
Maybe she's known about this longer than you know.
Clever, you know.
Hey, Don, you better watch out. Your wife's going to get a cedar gift from me.
Don't worry, our yard's long extended line of flowers compared to my neighbor that put out pesticides.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Anything else?
Those back
Yes,
to the burdocks that my wife interrupted me. They are hollow, so they might make. If I was to snip them off.
Yeah, sometimes they're a little too big.
Yeah.
And most of the solitary bees are smaller.
Okay.
So like a 5/32.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody use that. I was expecting more, some of these smaller ones.
Yeah. So that's a 1/4, that one is.
I think so. I think those may be lupin
Yeah.
stems.
Yeah.
That's what I think I remember. But yeah, can't hurt to try, right? Even if they're spacers. Now the other thing is you may get other things in there like spiders hunting for bees. But, and then there's also people that study bees are concerned that if you don't clean those out, you're spreading disease, right? So it's a good thing to, so somebody's actually helping me by cleaning that out every year, but they haven't been used. So I don't know what to do about this, about cleaning that out, but anyway, that was just an experiment, an excuse to try something. Anything else?
Did you notice more bees last summer than normal?
When I started this in 2016, I think I sampled 4 species in my yard, but I was just starting. But what I got back from the state, I think I have 4 different species in my yard. The last 2 years, in 2020, other than early on in the season, I had common eastern. And then when it got dry, nothing.
Right.
There was nothing anywhere.
I noticed last year, home, we've had more bees. I've never seen so many bees.
Well, last year I had common eastern and tricolor bumblebees doing very well. So I don't know that I'm answering your question really well, but
What kind of tree is it, Laura?
We have a linden,
yeah.
not a little leaf, but a regular
Big
one.
one.
And it was humming.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it was amazing.
Beetles, ants, wasps,
Can't believe it.
bees,
Just
bumblebees.
stop it.
Yeah.
And it was,
You can hear it and smell
When you
it.
see
Oh, yeah.
them, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
yeah, it was pretty.
They don't
And-
want to go home, though, and the next morning you go in the hall, frozen on the floor.
Yeah, yeah.
I know.
Yeah, but if they can get some warmth, they'll be back.
Yeah.
What's interesting is bumblebees, because they can generate their own heat, they're not endotherms like us. They don't generate their heat regularly. They do it on demand, so they classify them as facultative endotherms, which I think is cheating. They really need outside temperature, and then they can supplement with shivering.
But how come they don't go back into our hive at night?
The men do not go back in.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Now, sometimes because they can generate their own heat, they may go out. Bumblebees go out longer and into twilight more than any other bee, but usually when they're doing that, it's they're not bringing back as much pollen or nectar, from what I read.
So I guess the females are a little smarter, they go back home.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, either that or the male are gonna get kicked out.
Yeah.
Mama's not taking them
Or
back.
they'd rather stay on the flower.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to mention that Cooperative Extension has a pollinator certification program for, you can have a pollinator certified yard.
Oh, nice. Thank
And
you.
you look on their website. Actually, yeah, I don't know if it's on under the Master Gardener section.
Okay.
But there's like different criteria. You have to provide so much food, water. You can't use pesticides. I mean, there's other things that
Right.
if you don't
What's the
do.
website?
It's for University of Maine Cooperative Extension.
Okay.
It's really cool. I've been in the process of trying to do that. A lot of it's based
Yeah.
on native plants.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the first time I went out in my yard and I planted flowers for years, and I was tallying up which ones are native and which ones. I had like 5 native species. I was shocked that the stuff that is sold, mostly the ornamentals, are not native.
No.
And some of the native ones I've started growing some of my own from seed and trying to get them out in different places. But they're maybe not as attractive to us, but they're definitely more attractive to the native pollinators and stuff. But anyways, I encourage you to go check that out on the Master Gardener website.
And while you're mentioning that, milkweed, bumblebees do like milkweed, and also it helps the
Monarchs.
monarchs. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been growing some of that too. I got a lot of milkweed seed if anybody wants it.
Any other thoughts?
I know in my office, they used to call it soil conservation, but now it's natural resource conservation. They get a program for some type of something plant for bees and all that.
Yes. Yeah. Actually,
I should have brought some of those.
I talked to them, and I was going to do something, but what I had already done had some partial cutting done, and I had some pasture, and so he thought I was all set.
Yeah.
And plus, when he was available to come up, we still had snow on the ground, so it was hard for him to really see, because he's coming up from Bangor. Yeah. Joanne.
I was going to say,
Thank you.
some of these were little steps, but if each of us took one little step, it would be so helpful.
Yeah.
And we just need that. I mean, we all have to figure out what to do.
I'm glad you said that, because just a little bit is all it takes. There's a program going on, and I can't think of the professor at University of Delaware now. I've heard him lecture twice. You know who I mean? But anyway, they have, our National Park, and you can go on and tell this website, our National Park, how many acres you are going to put into the park, and they're trying to build up acreage, even if it's a couple square feet here, a couple square feet there, throughout the whole country for pollinators. It's not just for pollinators, actually, it's for diversity of life. Yeah. I apologize, I can't think of his name. Not the last name, anyway. So anyway, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Appreciate you coming out. Thank you, Don.
So I just got a notification. I think we're going to have cloud cover.